students. But great. So shall I welcome to the stage, please, Dr. Rebecca Watson and Professor Meric Srokosz. So for a little bit of background, because they're academics, I have to tell you a little bit about their bio. So Dr. Rebecca Watson is currently Dean of Studies at Hild College in Yorkshire. She received her PhD in Old Testament Studies from Oxford. Together with Meric, she has published the book Blue Planet, Blue God. And she worked at the Faraday for a little while as well. Professor Meric Srokosz is Professor of Physical Oceanography at the National Oceanography Centre down in Southampton. He is the former Associate Director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. His PhD is in Applied Mathematics from Bristol University, and he is, with Rebecca, the co-author of this book. So lovely to see you back, because I actually haven't seen you in Cambridge together for quite a while. First of all, we'll start with Rebecca. I wanted to find out why anyone would want to spend their life looking at the sea in the Old Testament. What took you on this journey to start this research?
It probably started, actually, because when I was an undergraduate, the lecturer who taught me most on Old Testament studies, who was also my personal tutor, had written on the topic. And every week he would set me a chapter from his book to read, and the more I read it, the more I thought, this isn't right. And I kind of progressively found myself disagreeing more and more with what he'd said. And so when it came to writing a PhD, it was kind of an obvious thing to start off rebutting his ideas, which was great until he was allocated to me as a supervisor, which didn't work quite so well. But
And Meric, the same. What took you into oceanography? Was it a convenience if you were living in Southampton, or was it really a passion?
No, I wasn't living in Southampton at the time. I did my PhD in the maths department in Bristol University on wave power. It was the 1970s, and there was an oil crisis, for those old enough to remember, and alternative energy was quite popular. And at the end of my PhD, sadly had to get a job, having spent 6 years as a student, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And the job that came up that I got was working on waves at the Institute of Oceanographic Sciences, as it was then, which then moved to Southampton to become the National Oceanography Centre. And since then, I've done other things than waves. I've done all sorts of stuff.
So we can thank a time of adversity that you needed to get a job.
That's true, yes.
You're here today. Let's start with the Bible, which was a real influence behind this. May I ask you, Rebecca, 71% of the earth is made of water. How much of the Bible refers to water?
not 71%, but a lot more than people imagine. In fact, when we began this project, one of the main challenges, I think, was narrowing down what to look at, because it is mentioned hugely. And of course, some of the best-known stories in the Bible are centered around the sea. Something like Noah and the Ark, or Jesus stilling the storm, Jonah and the whale, are some of the best-known stories in the Bible. But actually, the sea features very frequently, as does God's action in creation more widely.
And are there many words that refer to the sea? Because I know that quite often when we translate the Bible, what words refer to sea or water or rivers?
Well, there's a particular word for water. Funnily enough, the word for heaven also is derived from the stem for water, which is probably because actually the heavens were seen as the waters above. There's a word for sea, but it doesn't precisely equate to our sea. The sea for the Hebrew writers was a large body of water. Interestingly, when we look at the Sea of Galilee, that's just really an inland lake. But from a Hebrew mindset, that was sea. Interestingly, when you read the Gospels, although Matthew and Mark talk about the Sea of Galilee, for Luke, he refers to it as a lake. And scholars often think that Luke perhaps came from a more Greek background, so he would have conceptualized it differently. There's also something called the deep. And the deep... There are different levels to it. I mean, on one level, the deep is the bottom of the ocean, but it's also seen to feed both the oceanic water supplies and fresh water. They didn't seem to think that maybe salt water and fresh water should be distinguished too sharply, unless you're thinking about drinking it. And it was imagined, although we think of the water cycle as water evaporating and going up to the sky and coming down again, for them, the chief water cycle, I mean, obviously they were aware of clouds and rain, the chief water cycle would be the water of the deeps, of the sea, somehow flowing invisibly back to the mountains, ready to go back down again.
And so, Meric, your study of the sea has taken you to the deep, into submarines, is that?
No.
No, not at all.
Never been in a submarine. Wouldn't
I
want
was-
to.
I was-
Tin cans, bad idea.
I thought I had remembered a story of a submarine, sorry.
No, go to sea on ships, but
So
not in submarines.
why would we want to combine the look at the Bible and the Old Testament specifically with you to get this book? What's the purpose?
Well, that's the
of
reason I got
writing?
this project initiated when I was at the Faraday Institute was because as an oceanographer, I'm very aware the oceans are an important part of the physical climate system and the biological system. And as a Christian, I was aware that very little had been done in terms of studying the Bible about it. There's been lots written about ecology and environment, but it's written from a very terra-centric, land-centered point of view. So I initiated this project and worked with Rebecca because I needed an Old Testament scholar, because I can't do Old Testament Hebrew, to try and pull together what we understand about the oceans with what the Bible says about the oceans. Because I think as Christians, we need to apply our faith to our work.
Right, so I've been nice and kind so far. So getting to this. So it's divided lovely. There are lots of lovely chapters. It talks about vulnerability, chaos. Is it not just the green theology, hippie-wearing Christians, and being, me here,
Yeah, sure, yeah.
that need to read this book? Why should the knowledgeable people of Cambridge want to dive in literally to the book and find out why we need to care about our sea?
I mean, it covers much more than just... it does cover the environmental issues to do with the ocean, but it covers much more. We talk about trade, travel and economics. We talk about vulnerability, chaos in terms of how that affects us as human beings, because we have a chaotic aspect to our own lives. Things happen to us where adversity comes in. Unexpected things happen, and how do we respond to that? And I think some of the scriptures in the Old Testament and in the New Testament help us to know how to respond to adversity. And often storms are used as a picture of adversity, and how we respond to the storm. And the thing that comes across to me when I read the Bible is that although the ocean can be chaotic and dangerous, and having been on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic in 18-meter waves, I know it can be quite dangerous. The fact is that God is in control. So actually, ultimately, it doesn't matter. God is in control, whether it's chaotic or not.
So you have a whole chapter about the sea being vulnerable, and I'm sure, having watched Blue Planet, I'm proud. For a minute, I was worried there was going to be a plastic bottle on my table. But we've been taught to, care for our oceans. That the ocean, although it's very strong, you mentioned in here, it can do disastrous things, which we will come on to in a minute. It is vulnerable. So what can we actually do from reading your book to learn how to look after the sea?
Well, there's lots of things. I mean, the plastics thing is interesting because we've been doing work on plastics at the Oceanography Centre for several years now, trying to work out what's going on. But it was David Attenborough's programme Blue Planet 2 that brought it to public attention, and suddenly everybody's aware of it and doing something about it. But actually, possibly a bigger problem longer term is climate change and our use of carbon dioxide, or our use of fossil fuels generating carbon dioxide, and that's going to lead to sea level rise and things that will impact the poorer communities around the world. People like in Bangladesh, a metre sea level rise will displace 10 million people. So I think, and that brings adversity to them. So I think we need to think carefully about how we live our lives in terms of fossil fuel use.
Now, Rebecca, I want to ask you a question about your favourite part of exploring the Bible during this project. I watched Rebecca frustratingly writing this. Every staff meeting for about 18 months, we'd say, "What have you been doing?" She said, "Looking at the sea and the Bible." Looking at the sea and the Bible. So you must have, during this time, found something that really excited you, and it was your favourite bit that you might want to go back to.
Yes, lots of things that excited me. I'm just struggling now to think about what excited me most. There are wonderful passages on the sea. I think one of the most, two of the most appealing, if I may. One is Psalm 104, which talks about God's provision for his creation, how he created the world in the first place, but then continually provides and sustains for it. And there's a lovely line about Leviathan, this beast of the deep, and how he made it to sport in the sea, that it's kind of a playground for this vast creature. And then picking up on that theme, if you look in the book of Job, Job suffers terrible disasters and accuses God of being his persecutor, effectively, and God appears in the whirlwind and displays his wonders of creation before Job. But one of the things he reveals is this monster, Leviathan again, and how actually God delights in this creature that's inimical to human welfare. It's terrifying, and yet for God he's hugely proud of this awful creature, which says a lot, I think, about God's concerns not being anthropocentric, that he's much bigger, and the scope in creation for things that we can't understand or master, and we're not the centre of it all.
So at this point, I'm going to thank you both for just a few teasing questions. I love to watch my colleagues get excited about very different things. I love the sea, to go swimming in. I don't think I could spend all that time on a boat out at sea. To finish and to join on to our next, thank you very much. You will get the time to talk to them, ask them questions at the end. I'm going to read you a little extract from the book. Probably should have asked one of you two to read this, really, shouldn't I? So we talked about chaos, we talked about the sea being dangerous. So this is a little bit from the fact that the sea retreated, it is called. In reality, when the sea dramatically retreats, this is a warning of a particularly unpredictable and potentially devastating form of natural disaster, a tsunami. This is exactly what happened in the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004 in the Indian Ocean. This tsunami led to the deaths of over 230,000 people in the coastal communities bordering the Indian Ocean. One young British girl, Tilly Smith, saved the lives of about 100 tourists because she had been taught in a school that a sign of the imminent arrival of a tsunami was the sea retreating from the shore. When she saw the sea receding dramatically, she alerted her parents to the danger, and they persuaded fellow holidaymakers to move quickly to a higher ground before the tsunami wave struck. And I'm going to leave it there. But there are copies of it at the downstairs. And this brings me on to my next two guests, who are going to talk about their research in natural disasters. And I think I named it for this purpose, from Haiti to Somerset. So please may I welcome to the stage Professor Bob White and Reverend Dr. Roger Abbott. So, again, a little bit of bias because they are academics. So Reverend Dr. Roger Abbott is Senior Research Associate at the Faraday Institute. He's working on so-called natural disasters from a faith perspective. He received a PhD in practical theology from the University of Wales, and he is currently doing field work in Haiti, the Philippines, Somerset, and there are more, I think. Yeah, so there we go. Thank you. And this is Professor Bob White. Bob is the director of the Faraday Institute and one of its founders. He is Professor of Geophysics at the University of Cambridge. He's also Fellow of the Royal Society, and there are many more acronyms to go after his name too. And he is a recipient of the Gold Medal of the Royal Astronomical Society. This is the most prestigious award you can receive. This is my sideline, it's not in the bio. He is the director of the Faraday. I said this already, so welcome, Bob. And from his tie, you can see that his natural disaster is volcanoes. So welcome. We are going to play you a little film just to introduce their project. So here we go.
We begin tonight with Hurricane Katrina, which could be among the biggest storms ever to hit this country.
Hurricane Katrina is now a Category 5 hurricane.
It is supposed to hit New Orleans, a low-lying city surrounded by water, a possible worst-case scenario. They're calling for mandatory evacuations.
This is a threat that we have never faced before. God bless us.
There was no electricity. There was no water. There were no commodities. There was a wasteland.
Hurricane Katrina was a particular event where human flourishing was catastrophically interfered with. People asked, how can a good God allow such things to happen?
You ought to question God, because if he doesn't have the answer, then he's not God.
The intent of the project is to explore the influence of the faith beliefs of survivors from Hurricane Katrina, looking specifically at three kinds of relationships: their relationships with God, their relationships with the community, and the relationship with the natural environment.
My personal home was destroyed with more than 7 feet of water. My father's home was also destroyed. 2 of my sister's homes were destroyed.
80% of the city was flooded and underwater. Nobody really knows how many people got swept out to sea.
I was the pastor of the Legion Fields Avenue Baptist Church, and our building was destroyed. It was just hard to believe what was going on, to realize that everything I owned was now in a suitcase.
We were gone from August, and we didn't get back until November, and that was just to come and see. They call it a drive-in and drive back out. It took my breath away because the house was off the foundation, flattened. All the houses here, the church was gone, destroyed. We had about 120 people in the congregation, and a lot of them were youth, and we just couldn't reach them at all.
So this is just a little snippet. If you want to watch the full video, there is a link on our website. So to start with, let's start with Roger, having been featured in this video. So first of all, Roger, how did you get into trauma response or pastorship? I think that's where you started before you came to the Faraday.
Yes, well, I was 30 years in local church pastoral work, which is traumatic enough, as anybody in pastoral work will know. But in particular, in January 1989, I was asked to respond to an aircraft crash on the M1 in the East Midlands. And I was involved with that for 2 years, at least, in the aftermath and so on. And that led me then to being invited to be a part of a human aspects group of the Emergency Planning Society right through until 1991 through to 2006. And all the while I was wanting to do research of the particular incident that I had been involved in. And in particular, as a pastor, I wanted to unpick my own experience of that response, the challenges that it had posed to my own theological beliefs and understanding, as well as to my pastoral work. So I had the opportunity then to do that PhD, and while I was doing that, I was also invited to go to Haiti immediately after the earthquake, and as a chaplain, and work there with the earthquake and with cholera, when cholera was at its worst. So that was my baptism, if you like, into the world of adversity, big time.
And our director, Bob, you work with earthquakes as well as volcanoes. What brought you to wanting to spend time with rocks and looking at the earth move?
Well, actually, I came to Cambridge, this is the honest truth, I came to Cambridge to do physics and it was too hard. So I did geology. And also the geologists did these really cool field trips and things, so they'd spent the summer going around nice places, which I still do, actually. So yeah, that's what brought me to it. What brought me to this interface between science and religion is that I'm a Christian, and my work is with earthquakes, volcanoes and such like, and if you're going to have any integrity, obviously your faith and your work have to be coherent. You can't just be a Christian on Sunday and not on Monday through Saturday. So I was really interested in how these things fitted together. Yeah, I can tell you more about that in a minute, because they do.
So together you managed to get some money together, a research grant, and off goes Roger. When I first arrived at the Faraday, I thought this was a fictional person because Roger was off to the Philippines, then he was off to Haiti, and he would stop by very quickly on a hot desk, and off he'd go half an hour later, and I'd think I might have imagined it. So you have been to Haiti, the Philippines, New Orleans, as we see in the video. May I ask if and Somerset, I mustn't forget the UK. May I ask if going to see the responses from people in the aftermath of such huge disasters, is there one country that sticks more in your mind as being more affected, or would you say that a disaster is a disaster for whoever?
Well, a disaster is a disaster for whoever, whether it's individual or whether it's mass. Clearly the ones I've been to have been big time. There's a certain uniqueness to each location. They're all very beautiful locations where terrible things have happened. They're all essentially low income, low middle income countries, which ties up with Meric's observation that they're the ones that really do suffer when natural hazards are in effect. I suppose the one has to be Haiti, a much maligned nation of people, surrounded by a lot of mythology and rumor, principally by rich Western nations. But a delightful people, a people I came to love, a country I came to love very dearly, but a country that is so vulnerable by virtue of its economics, its poverty, its political situation, and its exposure and vulnerability to annual hurricanes and to landslides and periodically to major earthquakes. So yeah, it has to be Haiti. Because I saw things there, and I mentioned cholera, and I worked in a field hospital with people who had already lost their homes at the earthquake, or had been injured by the earthquake, or who had lost loved ones in the earthquake, survived, and then were struck down by this absurd disease. I call it absurd because it was imported, it should never have been there. But cholera is a devastating disease, can kill someone within 2 hours if they don't get the requisite treatment. And to sit with these people who are still able to thank God, and I say this quite literally, and to sing and to pray and to give thanks to God for their life, their survival, has to be Haiti in that sense.
So what has your research come? So I know from the media, from a Western privileged point of view, perhaps we really quiz. If there is a God, why on earth would he bring such horrific suffering on somebody or a nation, especially this sort of thing? So having observed this and seen this, what has your research brought out about what, if you're saying they say thank God, what have you found out about people's faith in this time of adversity?
Well, that has been the principal focus of our research, to explore the impact and influence of faith beliefs in the event of great tragedy. And I, as a pastor and as a white Western Brit, have been heard so often, people when they read news accounts and they watch media accounts say, how can you believe in God when that kind of thing happens? What kind of a God allows that kind of thing to happen? Now, I've interviewed hundreds of people who have survived these terrible tragedies. And as I said, I can count on less than one hand the number of people who have in any way blamed God for what happened. And that has been the rich material, and in many ways perhaps the surprising material for us white Westerns who like to spectate on these incidents more than actually be involved in them. So the majority have overwhelmingly been so grateful for their faith and so grateful for the fact that their belief in a God, the one thing that hasn't moved in their lives, when everything else has moved, even the earth has moved, even the rocks have moved. But there is one rock in terms of God that they passionately hold on to, that for them hasn't moved.
So you both, I know, say there are no such things as natural disasters. And just linking, can we stay with Haiti for a while? So I've seen Bob talk about the fact that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. And there is a picture that will always stay in my mind. It's a picture of a hospital and a digital communications tower. Can you tell me about this picture, Bob?
Well, you've heard it, but yeah, I've got this amazing photograph from Haiti just after the earthquake, and there were two brand new buildings. One was a 4-story hospital built for the locals. The other was a 13-story telecommunication built by an American telecommunications company. Actually, the only high-rise in Haiti, I think, or the highest one, with glass all around the outside, like high-rise buildings do have. And the photograph, they were both built within 12 months, just before, brand new buildings of the earthquake. The photograph after the earthquake, not a single plate glass window was broken. There were just a few little cracks inside, which were just cosmetic. The 4-story hospital had collapsed down to 1 story, and many, many people were killed. And the reason for this is not that people don't know how to build buildings that don't fall down in earthquakes. And indeed, there were building codes in place in Haiti. But it's just the endemic corruption, which meant that builders didn't build in the way they should. Whereas the American company, because of litigation and so on, they do build to the building regulations. So that's why we say that this is a natural hazard and it's turned into a disaster by human agency, which in this case was very clear who was to blame. And I suppose the sad thing is that the people who die are often not the people who were to blame for the building in that case. But the other 200,000 people died in Haiti, mainly because they were living in poverty from decades of misrule by Papa Doc Duvalier and his son, Baby Doc Duvalier, poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Years of colonial misrule. You know, France was still taking back interest payments on their supposed loss because the natives had taken back their own country when the slaves, it was one of the first slave countries that freed itself. So France said it's our country. And they were still paying interest back, though they were so poor, to France at the time of the earthquake. Now, actually, France very magnanimously said, that's all right, we'll write off that debt. But these are human factors. But they're not factors that usually are directly the fault of the people who die. So you'll often hear people say, well, those people died, they must have been very, very bad people for whatever your favourite pet hate is. And in fact, this is what people told Job. When he was suffering, they said he must have done something bad that he hadn't. And he said, no, I haven't, and I haven't. So that's why we don't talk about natural disasters that much. We prefer to say they're natural processes, which in themselves are good, and I can explain why if I have time, which human agency has turned into disasters.
You can see this picture on a banner downstairs when you're having a glass of wine or a soft drink.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it is downstairs. So yeah, tell us then, Bob, actually, as you look at volcanoes, Bob is, I don't know if he will tell you about this, but the ash cloud that stopped lots of you going on holiday, I believe you created some sort of way to make us know that this was going to happen. Is this
No,
correct?
not that one. That was 2010 at Easter. Lots of people had a holiday. No, there was a bigger, 10 times bigger eruption in 2014, which we were the first to find. But it was right in the middle of Iceland, and it didn't hurt anybody, so it was the perfect eruption in that sense. But these natural processes, now, what thing kills, what natural process kills most people? And you probably don't realise this, but it's the most mundane of things. It's floods. It's not volcanoes, it's not earthquakes, it's not tsunamis. Floods are what kill most people in the world every year. And of course we know they even kill people in England. Not uncommonly, 2 or 3 people die every year from floods in the Lake District, for instance, or in Cheltenham a couple of years ago and so on. But actually floods are good for the earth, because if it weren't for floods, you wouldn't have the fertile plains where we grow all our crops. If you lived in Egypt for the last 2,000 years, if the floods failed, you starved the next year, because the floods brought silt over down the river and onto the land on either side of the river. So floods are actually what make it a fertile place to grow crops and things. What's bad, of course, is that if you build your house on a floodplain, it's likely to get flooded, and that's actually what we've discovered in Somerset and in Cheltenham and other places. And that's human agency again, which is building things in the wrong place. So floods actually are quite important. Volcanoes are really important, because it's volcanoes that bring all the nutrients to the surface of the earth that we need to grow crops. If you go somewhere like Hawaii, which is nothing but a volcano, it is just a volcano sticking out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, it's the most biodiverse area on Earth, although it's a volcano, and that's because it's bringing nutrients up. So if it weren't for volcanoes, this would be a sterile Earth, and there'd be no life on it. And even earthquakes, which you might think, what possible use are there earthquakes? But you wouldn't get something like the Himalayas. You can't push up the Himalayas without earthquakes. And if you go to the top of the highest point, Everest, it actually comes from the deepest ocean. The sediments on top have come from deep in the Indian Ocean. It's been pushed up by earthquakes, and it's those mountains getting eroded off and carrying soil down to the floodplains, which is what enables us to thrive. And actually, the Himalayas also provide water for 1 billion people. So, yeah, all these things are good, and if it weren't for these processes, it would be a sterile Earth, as most other planets we know about are. So it's just if we interact with them badly that you get a disaster.
So I'm glad you've brought up Somerset. I like being proud of the people I work with. Roger also is a trauma response pastor, so he doesn't just go and talk to people after natural disasters. He also has responded to things like Grenfell, the Manchester bombings, the Hillsborough disaster. So I have a question, which would be, do you find that after disasters such as these, which are very obviously, in our face, man-created, I know that you think also the other disasters are man-made too. Is there a difference in the way that people respond with their faith or divert their anger because it hasn't come from the earth, as it were?
What I have found in responding to the kind of incidents, the UK-based ones in particular, is that we are much more a secular as well as Western sophisticated society. So people are more inclined to go directly to human agency. They'll blame the government. Somerset was the Environment Agency or the local authority. Grenfell Tower, it was the local authority and the failure with which they manifestly let the people down. In the bombings, if you're not careful, you can get ethnic tensions and religious tensions and kickback. Although I must admit, in the areas where I worked, which are very central to where the incident happened, but where a lot of people came to pay their respects, take Manchester, for instance, what so impressed me there is that there were hundreds and hundreds of people queuing up to come and lay flowers and so on. And there was a tremendous silence that fell on the city and a huge amount of respect that people showed to each other across the ethnic divide. And that was something that really, really impressed me, that in times of adversity, even here in the UK, you don't just see the worst in human nature, you also see the best. And you would just long that the best would become a common phenomenon when in times of peace, if you like. But all too often, I'm afraid, society reverts to type. But in times of adversity, you see a lot of sadness, a lot of sorrow, a lot of tragedy. But you do see a huge amount of good.
Well, on that note, I'm going to draw this pairing to a close because you'll get to answer some more questions. I know that Bob can talk about the earth and volcanoes and everything passionately for ages, and I know you can talk about your personal experiences. If you found this fascinating, this research project is drawing to a close later on this year, and with this in mind, there is a weekend conference, the 13th to the 15th of April, bargain of £45 for 2 days. But the weekend will comprise of having people such as Roger and Bob. So you'll have the science and you'll have the theology, but you'll also have some of the survivors from Haiti we're flying over, which is I think could be quite a touching experience. And we also have John Mosey, who is going to talk about the reflection of Lockerbie as well. So
you might say he lost his daughter in Lockerbie.
Yeah, okay.
And his great campaign has been a charity for forgiveness ever since. Very interesting man.
So if you'd like to sign up for this course, you can downstairs. So that is my little bit of promo for this section. So for the final pairing, I would like to welcome to the stage two of my more recent colleagues. They have been working at the Faraday for about 2 and a bit years, and Alexander has been here before. So two amazing young academics with a lot of potential and a lot to share. And please may I welcome to the stage Dr. Alexander Massman and Dr. Joseph Tennant. So here we go with a bit of blurb. So Dr. Joseph Tennant is Research Associate at the Faraday Institute. He received his PhD at the University of Chicago in Comparative Human Development. He is currently collecting data on a project about mystical seizures. I hope he's not too tired. He had a packed house last night talking about his project, so he is here too. And with him is Dr. Alexander Massman. He is Research Associate at the Faraday Institute. He works on the ethics of human genome modification. He received his PhD in theology and ethics from the University of Heidelberg in Germany, and together with Keith Fox, who you saw at the beginning, he is writing a book on genome editing that addresses the general public. So welcome to both of you. You just let me have a glass of water. Okay, so to start with Joe, what on earth made you think that trying to get through the ethical clearing to talk to people who have epilepsy about mystical seizures and God, why would you come all the way to the UK to do this? Maybe I should ask first, actually. Actually, I've realised this. I know Joe very well, and so I do end up speaking really fast when we're together. Can you tell me what a mystical seizure is first?
Sure. So a mystical seizure is it's a seizure, but specifically a sensory aura is sort of a good way to put it, which is a type of seizure that rather than the generalized tonic-clonic seizures of the shaking and the fainting that we're used to, this is a seizure that has a purely experiential component. So more common auras are things like smells or unusual tastes, a sense of a rising gut. But occasionally these seizures have a mystical quality. Dostoevsky, the Russian author, famously felt as though the heavens were coming down upon the earth and he would be engulfed and he would see the face of God. So that is a very profound mystical statement, and this would lead directly into him a full loss of awareness and a tonic-clonic seizure. So that's the kind of thing that prompted this study. It's not the description of that was very interesting to me, and the reason I came to this project was I've been working on religion of psychology of morality sorry, let's start that sentence again. I was working on the psychology of morality and religion, and I've been very interested in religion as a cultural phenomenon as much as a thing that people value in their personal lives. And I felt that the thing that was lacking in psychology was a good understanding of direct religious experience. And this project is as close as I think we can get to a natural experiment on religious experience. So it seemed like a really groundbreaking opportunity, and I jumped at the chance and was lucky to get it.
And I didn't introduce Joe, but he's also you're not a medic at all, are you? You're a psychologist?
I'm a cultural psychologist.
Yeah, there we go. So I would see, and as many, a medical, I have to be careful here, but something wrong with me is perhaps a time of adversity. So with this study, you get to interview people. What has helped people to come to terms with the fact that they have these auras and they think that they might see God or gods or spirits? What on earth has made them think that they can cope with this and not take medication and get through this?
Well, many do take medication. I do want to emphasize that. One of the reoccurring themes we've seen with people with these auras is a desire to make them stop, despite the enjoyable nature of them. At the end of the day, epilepsy is a very difficult and debilitating disease for many people, and the preference is always being clear of seizures. But for those who don't have that kind of seizure freedom, these auras can be at times a source of strength. One of the participants in our study expressed that she would have an aura where she would sometimes lose perspective and sort of see above her own body and be looking down upon herself. But it would also come with a sense of reassurance. She would suddenly know that she was going to be okay, and an intense sensation of calm would come over her, and she would know that she was being looked after by something. And she never really put a name to it, but she believed it was a supernatural, spiritual thing. And so for someone whose life was very much derailed by epilepsy, this was a way of at least feeling as though she knew she would make it through. And so she drew strength from that aura, even though that aura was tied to the thing that was making her life so precarious. So there's this very interesting mix of hope and terror built into the disease in these particular cases.
So you mentioned that she thinks that something is protecting her.
Yeah.
I know that through some of your research, you have talked about the difference between protection and risk. Could we talk to the audience about what you found?
Yes, so I mean, as I've sort of said, it's this dual tension. And in this particular case, there is a lot of risk. I mean, their seizures come in clusters, so sometimes it would be 3, 4, 5 a day. Frequently, she bites her tongue, she falls, she injures herself. This is a patient with multiple surgeries, has had a good section of her temporal lobe removed. Every day is very precarious for this person. For another patient, the person we had actually speaking on stage last night at the event, she did not get an epilepsy diagnosis for about 8 years, despite having auras, because she never had a convulsive seizure. And so she recounted to us a story of she was on the M11 driving and suddenly had a transportive aura where she found herself in a desert country trying to help women surrounded by sand and water, which to her perspective was something from 3 to 5 hours. And then she came back to and was somewhere else along the M11, had been driving the whole time. She guessed about 10 minutes based on her destination. That could have been disastrous. So there is intense risk built into these experiences, even though that experience for her is exceptionally profound and is an aura, a sensation she misses, despite being very glad that she doesn't have these seizures anymore. So it's tied together.
And when you talk to them, is there a particular faith that they think that, because I say God or gods, is spiritual, mystical experience. Is there a particular faith that comes out in your research?
Yeah, there is a kind of distinct spirituality. Neither of these women are expressly religious. One was raised as a Catholic, but was actually very poorly treated by her grandmother within the Catholic Church, so she left that faith. She now attends a church irregularly, but has a very strong sense that there is a purpose and order to things in the universe and that something does look after her, but it's not a specific religion. The other patient was not raised religious. She was like nominally Jewish as a child and has no current faith but is spiritual by her own description in the sense that she expresses gratitude every day for being seizure-free and being alive, and does believe there are things that connect throughout the universe, but is no formal religion in that regard, which is interesting because it's very different from Dostoevsky. It's different from Saint Birgitta of Sweden, who is very much seems to have had some form of epilepsy that was at least related to some of the visions she had. So I think there are times in which this has been directly linked to something like Christianity. This is not the case for these patients. And I think that reflects in part the more secular nature of the United Kingdom at this time.
So thinking about auras, seeing people, thinking about faith, many Christians talk in tongues. Could people think then that those who have seizures and see these auras, this is another part of faith, and therefore you might need to talk in tongues, see these auras to be a real Christian? Here we go. There's my antagonistic question.
Sure, that's fair. And I think that's something that actually our project tries to push back on a bit, is that especially for the epilepsy case, while there are religious communities that may recognize these as sacred visions or symbols, we're not here to make a claim upon that because we're not those communities in many ways. But we also don't think that these are normal religious experience. You recognize these are unusual and they have an unusual character to them. And I think one of the things our project is trying to do, and the research is ongoing, is compare these to people who are neurologically healthy who practice their religious faith very intensely. We're recruiting right now, actually, to find those controls. And I do believe we're going to find pretty clear differences. The normal religious life is not the experiences these people are having. And I don't think having an unusual aura of that type is a requisite for practicing faith authentically.
And then as well, I suppose, so Joe works with a very amazing professor, Professor Alistair Coles. He is a neurologist at Adam Brooks. You also travel to UCLH as well, the University College London Hospital, to do this research. Neurologically then, could I say then, because we see these auras, is faith just an illusion then that has been created in our brain?
Only the easy questions, yeah. So Sigmund Freud might have said that. He had this conception of a God as an illusion and a response to uncertainty and fear and paternal misgivings, et cetera, et cetera. Jung did something similar. I'm very skeptical of these claims in the same way that I'm skeptical of labeling people as suffering from false consciousness and sort of the Marxist discourse. I don't like prescribing authentic truths to people's beliefs and thoughts. I think that doesn't, A, get us anywhere analytically. I think, B, it's a bit demeaning to those communities. And I think to call faith an illusion would be, just because it exists in the brain, is to call love an illusion or memory an illusion because it exists in the brain. I am not a metaphysicist. I'm not actually even a faithful person. I'm personally an atheist. But I recognize that my experiences are mediated through my brain in the same way that faith experiences are mediated through the brain. And I know that in part because we observe this in epilepsy where people aren't choosing to have these experiences. They're forced upon them. So I think that trying to reduce down in that way is really imprecise and kind of disrespectful, and I think lacks an intellectual rigor.
I had to ask it before one of the audience did, so there we go. Moving on to Alistair, but they link quite well. So Alexander, he looks at genome modification. So we're looking at vulnerable people with epilepsy, but then we're also thinking about protection and resilience of us. We now want to be medically safe, medically healthy. There are loads of advancements, make sure that we save people, we look after them. We all strive to have this, but what negative implications have you seen with your research that we are perhaps looking at with people with disability?
Yeah, so maybe first of all I could just tie this back and speak a little bit about what it is that I'm looking at. Genome modification, it might be helpful for the audience. It's a catchphrase that's often around in the media. Gene therapy, sometimes it comes under other gobbledygook like CRISPR-Cas9, and indeed, as you said, it's researchers hope that they might address a different set of conditions, not neurological conditions, but genetic inherited disorders or illnesses. But then there's of course the question, we could use it to alleviate or cure diseases, but also modify bodies perhaps in other ways, and that's where questions of disability come in indeed. So the interesting thing is there's not just the technology involved and the science. When you're looking at genome editing, you're also looking at cultural assumptions. In what ways do we think about bodies? What are the ideal ways, or how do we envision a life that is satisfactory and flourishing? And that is indeed one of the things that I think we should discuss a bit more. If we are all enthusiastic about the humanitarian potential with these new therapeutic technologies, what is the message that we're transporting about what human life should look like? And is there perhaps a danger that either people with chronic illness or people with disability might be labeled as those whom we cannot cure, if indeed we want to call this a disease, and label these people as deficient. And I think the important thing would be to look at the experience of all sorts of people, look at the lives, how they're really experienced, the gratefulness people have when a condition is alleviated, but also the way, for example, some people with disability identify with their condition and refuse to be pinned down to whatever, not being up to the task or requiring help. Also, the reality of disability would be quite different.
I guess the Stephen Hawking's death today. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yes, that's fine. We might mention this in a moment because, yeah, obviously our thoughts are with the family at this time. So, yeah, as you were saying, the way we treat people, the way we look at what it is to be human, the standards, the hopes, and the enhancements. Can I bring you back to your theology, because you are a very amazing theologist. Can we talk about, so some might say that if we do not experience pain, suffering, times of adversity, we're not experiencing the world how God might want us to. And I mean, something that sticks in my mind, but you might want to use a different example, Alexander, is the example of Paul in the Bible and disability. Can you bring out the theology of how this might look at how your research is looking at the ethics of this change of disability?
Right. Again, as I said, it's a real challenge and a fascinating task to look at the real experience of people. And one of the ways I think about theology is to point us in new directions and make us aware of realities that we haven't thought about. So often the narrative in society would be that people with disability, well, they suffer, or there are ethicists who say they're in a harmed state. And even theologians identify disability with weakness, so you should have sympathy, right? Now the interesting part is one of the most influential persons in Western history, perhaps besides Jesus and Muhammad, if you just look at impact, would be the Apostle Paul. And interestingly, he writes in his letters that he had a disability. So he spoke of a thorn in the flesh, and he asked God in prayer that would be taken away from him. And New Testament scholars suggest that perhaps when he was taken by Roman authorities and flogged and beaten up for being a rabble-rouser, that left scars. And then what I found so interesting is that it's not that he says people with disability need sympathy or so. There's this remarkable verse that says or he experiences God saying to him, my strength is perfected in weakness. I think that's a really intriguing way to think about not only disability, but physical states in general. It's not about being either strong, self-sufficient, reliant, or needy and weak or so, but even people who have physical deficits in one sense can still have great strengths. Say, somebody who has never experienced adversity might just not be able to inspire other people when speaking to them. Now, of course, we don't want to romanticize vulnerability, but part of what I take away from this theological, ethical reflection is that we subvert our common stereotypes and shake things up a bit to gain a richer experience of reality, and rather than just subjecting things to stereotypes, weakness, deficits, strength, ideals, etc. And I think those perceptions of reality are really important in talking about how do we want to handle a technology like genome modification.
So I suppose we think, and lots of medics do think, that we're helping humanity, we're improving humanity. If we minimise the disability, in fact, we're making people's lives richer. Alexander sometimes has explained this to me about a couple who decide to have a baby or not have a baby. As to whether we would like, what an enhancement is in life. Can you share this example with the audience for me?
Yeah, well, you brought up the issue of enhancements. So in the background, there would be the question, we can use, or we might use, this is futuristic, might use genome editing not only to cure disease, but perhaps to add a little extra functioning physical capabilities to people who are healthy already. And it's a common response for people just to jump on the bandwagon and say, well, greater capabilities, better bodily functioning, of course that will make my life better, that gives me more options. So I'll be stronger, I'll have more choice, etc. But I find it curious that this vision is so widespread. Oftentimes in reality, we don't function that way. So say a couple has a baby, a newborn, what people often don't think about is how vulnerable a young family would be. Completely new challenges, new problems, lack of sleep, etc. We often romanticize this, and you'd think, oh, why do these people do that to themselves? They're making themselves vulnerable in terrible ways. So if you want to maximize strength and choice, etc., then maybe the best thing is just not even to think about having a baby. And in fact, that's the choice many people make, which I don't want to disparage, of course. But if we were simply out to minimize vulnerability, then a lot of very profound, moving experiences would remain hidden from us. We wouldn't have those experiences. So it's talking about enhancements. The question is, what are the goals? How do we? What are the ideals of bodies that we try to strive for? And perhaps sometimes we're falling for stereotypes that are just not true to life.
Now, I could speak to all of these people for a long time, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to ask some questions. I have quite a few more, so if you don't have any, we can go for that. But I hope that just by looking at 3 research projects out of very many, you've seen the plethora of things that we do at the Faraday, and that all of these deal with people who have vulnerability, adversity, and some of the panel are people of faith, and some are people of no faith. And so I open the floor. You can be as antagonistic as you like. Deep deep questions. Let's put these guys on show and see what their research has to tell us. There are 2 microphones. Did I give you a microphone? There should be 2 microphones in the audience. And anyway, there's 1, 2, thank you. And so, any questions? Lady in the middle. Oh, wait for the microphone because we are recording you.
Yeah. Hi, Alexander, yes?
Alexander, yes.
They had, it was interesting listening to you talk about disability, and I always freak out slightly, having been a school teacher, and thought some of my most gifted children would be classified as disabled. And we all tend to think about disabled people, having a physical disability. And actually what worried me in what you were saying, I don't think it's about sympathy, I think it's about empathy. And how do we get to a common denominator? And there have been many instances where, as you said, especially deaf families will choose to remain a deaf family rather than have a hearing child in their family, because that would completely upset their balance. And I just would like to ask really, is, in the long run, do you think that we will, hopefully, so I've already answered the question for you, but we will move towards understanding that actually diversity is what moves us forward? I mean, you just have to look at Stephen Hawkins as an example that came up. I think, how do we push diversity is the real question. How do we recognise that diversity is actually what is going to make life so much better for everybody?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really profound insight. If genome editing ever got to that point that it might be routine, or people might edit out genetic factors that make them more vulnerable, etc., it's easy to imagine this. It wouldn't be a fun place to live, because if people really were so stereotyped, even in their physical traits. It's not about sympathy for people with disability, it's more about empathy, yes. And it's also about things that we can learn from them. Just think about all these many things that people think that will make them happier, another achievement of this sort or another piece of equipment of that kind. I can very easily imagine people with disability. I'm thinking of particular people here who just have a different perspective on life, who might say, well, none of that really matters to me. What matters to me is more, say, this personal connection, perhaps, etc. Is there a danger that we're losing those kinds of perspectives? I think there is a danger. My own work is not focused on, for example, questions of prenatal diagnosis. So there are technologies that would allow people to test very early on whether the baby that a woman is expecting might have Down syndrome. And there is the danger that the number of abortions might rise to such a level that Down syndrome would become rarer and rarer. And it's again the question of how society thinks about bodily ideals, this cultural space that we're shaping in one way or another. And what I would like to see is, now certainly I do value innovation with genome editing. I think it can be used for good things. I don't want to romanticize disease, so I'm hoping for certain cures. But as innovation takes place, I'm hoping for the public to recognize those different perspectives on reality, and perhaps to invest in public life in ways that would make life easier for people with disability. Think of public transport or library access, etc., those common goods. We often hear how genome editing might help save money in the health sector. Perhaps there might be ways that society can think in new ways how to make decisions about public life.
Alexander, can I just ask, sorry, is it true that in Iceland they now have no Down syndrome children this year, well last year of 2017, because they have made it compulsory for testing, etc.? Is this a true fact that I read in the media?
That's the way it was reported, yeah. It's a difficult issue. I am worried by that.
Sorry, Joe, I interrupted.
No, that's no problem. I just wanted to add that in terms of your question of how do we seek empathy, I think one of the big things we can do is make it a point to listen to the communities that are speaking. I know for within my own sort of circle, the autism community is very vocal about their lives and their experiences and how they don't want to be erased and how they are exactly who they are and who they want to be. And I think that perspective... That not at all, you're right. And so I think listening to that community and trusting their voices is something that doesn't happen right now. And if we want to try to get that empathy, we need to take people at face value and not assume their experiences are illusory.
Okay, any more questions?
Oh, surely some of you.
There must be some.
I think I'm right here.
Hiya. I was going to ask about the sea. How would you explain the description of the new creation in Revelation where it talks about there being no more sea?
So I'll start. Rebecca can correct me being... I think you have to be very careful interpreting the book of Revelation because it's very pictorial, metaphorical imagery. There's all sorts of stuff in there that we in our society find difficult to understand because we're not familiar with that sort of pictorial way of presenting things. I think also in that particular instance, the particular sea that is destroyed is the place where the devil and the bad things end up. So it's basically the removal of all things bad. However, there is still water flowing through the throne from the throne of God, which I assume goes somewhere, and I'm trusting that will be an ocean. So my interpretation personally would be that, that sea is pictorial of all the evil being removed from the world. But I do think that the new creation will contain both land and sea because it will be a renewed earth. And I think it would be an odd renewed earth if it had no water.
And I think you also probably have to read it also in the context of all creation praising God in Revelation, that the sea actually gives God praise along with the heavens and the earth. So there is a mutuality there. It's not as though God is somehow against the sea, even as it is in the current creation. I think it's focusing, it's being used in a much more symbolic way as the place where the beast and the devil and so on may be located.
Did you want to chip in, Roger? Did I hear a no?
No.
I just heard a bubbling on their question.
Didn't hear anything.
Thank you.
Very thorough.
Are there any more questions? Lady there.
On a very practical level, in your interviews with survivors of catastrophes and disasters, did you identify particular characteristics of people who showed most resilience or communities that demonstrate most resilience?
One of the things that I was very much aware, I mentioned earlier that most of the survivors spoke of their faith. There is an important but in my research results, and that is that faith was of great benefit, but it was of limited benefit. It was of important benefit in helping people try to understand and cope with what had happened. What it didn't do a lot of was help prevent things happening. In other words, it didn't do a great deal towards mitigation of future events. Now, that wasn't because they were not interested in mitigation, God forbid. It was because of a lack of education and that goes back to poverty. Now, what was an added benefit to their resilience, if we may use that in term, was particularly for the Haitian people, but also for many of the New Orleanians, particularly for the black communities in New Orleans and the poorer communities in New Orleans, is that in Haiti, for instance, for the majority of people, every day is a day to suffer. Every day is a survival task. Where do I get a meal? How am I going to feed my kids? How am I going to afford to go to the doctor even? And so on and so forth. And if you know anything about Haitian history, it's been one great history of struggle. And I believe there is a learned experience, learned strategies, if you like, of coping strategies with struggle that are passed down generationally. And those too have equipped people enormously for coping. One of the surveys that we used, because we did use a survey, although the principal method was ethnographic interviewing. One of the surveys we used was devised by, constructed by a psychiatrist in Turkey, deliberately for use originally with the Balkan War victims. It was then modified and used with reference to a catastrophic earthquake in Turkey, which is why we asked if we could use it and adopt it for the situation in Haiti. Now, the results of the study that they did in Turkey as a result of the earthquake, and they've written their book on this basis, recommends that people living in vulnerable areas to natural hazard should routinely be exposed to the kind of sensations that they will experience when an actual event takes place. So in fact, this group of people actually constructed a gadget, a machine, that people could go in where they could experience what happens when an earthquake happens. So you've got a kind of simulator. And the idea was that they would get used to this momentum so that they would know what to do when the real thing happened. So their method, their recommendation was that people in risk-averse areas should be exercising routinely, which in fact does happen in Japan, for instance, and in the United States and in various other places in the world. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen in the low-income countries because exercises cost money. They're expensive. But in Haiti, they had routinely been exposed not to earthquakes, but to pain and suffering and to loss. And that was of great benefit when the earthquake happened. I don't know if that answers you. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Can I ask one then? This is to all of the panel in various respects. So I won't bring politics into this. So we talk about money, funding, things like this. So you're all funded to do your research, hopefully to then influence potentially policies, things that are happening. If you could pick, each of you, just to, I'm thinking here, in your pairs perhaps, something that you think from your research should influence the world and the money should be spent on, because you're all coming to the end of your project, so you know you must be thinking about the next one. What would it be? So is it to make sure that disability is one, or can we go and influence stop corruption in these countries? So is there anyone who wants to jump in first? Is it plastic bottles in the sea? What should we be funding, or should you all just retire and we'll spend our money on something else?
Well, I think that's a fair point. I mean, I often think I'm very privileged as a Westerner to sit in my office and do research on something that's really interesting when there are people in the world who don't have enough to eat and drink. So I do have some serious issues personally thinking about that, and I think in what I do in my personal life, I try to mitigate that. I won't go into that because I think that's personal. I think one of the things that strikes me in thinking about lots of issues to do with disasters and problems is that one of the issues we should do is educate women, because in all circumstances around the world, educating women improves conditions. So my fundamental issue around the world is educate girls, because I think that will improve the world immensely.
Educate them or allow us to actually get somewhere where we can show our knowledge. You know, antagonistic question there for me.
Well, so okay, I can speak from my experience in oceanography. In my generation of oceanographers, there are very few women. In the next generation down, in my group, it's 50%.
So in science, you're saying?
Yeah, in my area.
Push the ladies through
No,
STEM
not
a
science.
bit more,
No, I think in the world more broadly, not just in the UK. I think out in the world, in the poorer countries especially, educating women is an absolutely critical element.
I just had to clarify that. Thank you. Where should we go next, Joe?
Sure, yeah. So this is actually a very recent thought. I had a person come up to me and sort of express that they wished some of this discussion of unusual auras was more prevalent because they were unfamiliar with circumstances in which people with epilepsy are tied up and restrained and treated as witches. And that's not uncommon in voodoo context. That's not uncommon, actually. I know a patient who was branded as a witch, who was called a witch by a family member and treated pretty poorly because of it. So I think in terms of what this project could achieve and what I hope the dissemination could do is make people aware that these experiences are not some sort of possession or evil attack. It's something that needs to be treated, not attacked. And to reduce that stigma and to increase knowledge and to go back to a previous comment, or empathy about what epilepsy really is and what people experience through it would be the aim. And there are places that do that. I mean, the Epilepsy Society is fantastic in the United Kingdom. The Emma, who is someone who works at the University College London hospitals, just promoting Epilepsy Society and volunteering. She beats all the doctors. She's there every morning. And that's very inspiring, but there needs to be more. And in terms of funding, people don't have time to talk about the sort of unusual subjective parts of having epilepsy. It's clinical diagnoses, it's get your medicine, and that's very important. But I think if we could slow down and had the sort of resources to slow down a little and hear from people experiencing it and match their concerns to the right needs and the right fixes for resources, that would be really ideal.
I'll ask Alex this question too. Because
So in part, money is not a problem in genome editing research. So there are all these biomedical companies that try to develop treatments, bring them to market, and there are many venture capital firms that have, in the US, invested over $1 billion into these companies. And I think in many ways that's a good thing, because that can help people live their lives with less pain or less difficulties. Now, what I'm more concerned about, again, is how we think about what we want to achieve, how we think about what bodies should be like. And that's, of course, a pretty diffuse subject. How do you invest money into that? So maybe I might come back to these disability questions. I think one issue where people might learn a lot is if they shared more of their daily lives with people who live differently, who live different lives. So perhaps inclusive education where people with and without disability share a classroom, and money would be required for some extra assistance on the teacher's side, probably. I think that would really give people new experiences, people of all kinds, make them think, and that might actually change our mindset.
Thank you, Alex. So over here, should we ask Bob?
No, Roger.
Oh, okay. Go. Let's ask Roger.
I think one thing that I feel very passionate about is, as you know from what I've said, that a lot of my work is done in low-income countries. And there are two factors there, and one is the corruption, which adds to that, not just national corruption, the nations themselves, but international corruption and interference. And that has a knock-on effect in terms of education. I feel education is a huge factor and something that really does need to be addressed, because I'm not a scientist, but working with Bob, I know there is a rich science to natural hazards. And that, combined with particularly faith, I think, is a huge educational resource and facility that could transform vulnerability and could lead to massive risk reduction in the low-income countries where I've worked. So it's that, and it's getting the international community to contribute to that rather than take advantage of the countries where they live. And we know from recent news that there are many who do take advantage and don't actually contribute as much as they should and could to the educational resources that these nations need.
Thank you, Roger. We'll go to Rebecca before I will have final words from Bob, so prepare some. Here we go.
It's interesting you should talk about funding, because, of course, there might be a lot of institutions wanting to fund genome editing, but biblical studies is somewhere off the bottom of the scale. So dreaming of funding is probably, well, I'll dream as much as I like. I'd love to be funded to carry on. I think, though, actually money in many ways is the issue that I want to tackle, because I think looking at the research we've done into the sea, we've brought out how valuable the sea is within the Bible, how it should be preserved and looked after, and how badly we failed in that. But I think the core thing to change people's hearts and minds actually is to change their attitude to money and consumption. Because in our culture, generally, I think people rate their worth in terms of what they own. And if they've got a bigger car, or they've got a newer kitchen, or the latest fashions, or whatever it is, somehow that gives people better self-esteem in many cases, and they rate themselves often according to what they have. And I think as long as we have that kind of cultural mindset, preservation of the environment is always going to be a major problem. So yeah, if we could shift to a less is more attitude, I think that would be the most transformative thing in relation to my project.
Thank you, Rebecca. So you have 30 seconds, Bob, to tell us then why science and faith perhaps is important that we fund this.
Well, what's my biggest achievement? I think you asked me before. And actually, I would actually echo what people have been saying here, that I'm engaged in education. I work in a university. I think my biggest achievement is the 60-odd PhD students that I've trained and who are going out doing all kinds of things, and hundreds of undergraduates are doing things. Education just changes everything. One of the things I've been interested in is climate change, and I've written about that. And one of the issues with climate change is burgeoning populations, because more people consume more, and of course they should all have the same standard of living. That would be fair to everybody. And in places like Britain, the natural birth rate is below replacement rate. It's only held up by immigration at the moment. But if you go somewhere like sub-Saharan Africa, the average number of children per woman is 13 or something like that. Most women don't want to have 13 children. I can tell you, a few do, but most don't. And the answer to that is better education, it's empowerment of women, better healthcare particularly, because then you don't have to have 13 children. And I think education, particularly in places where women or girls are really denied that access, is going to change things in the biggest way I can imagine in the world. I mean, I'm not going to save the world, but those people will.
Well, thank you to all my panellists, and thank you to all of you for being patient this evening.